O Lord, you fasted for 40 days and 40 nights for our sake. Grant that we may have similar self-discipline to follow your righteousness through Jesus Christ's power and merits. Amen. But we're in Arthur Donald Innes's Cranmer and the Reformation in England, Chapter 2, the Prologue, the Scholars' Movement. The spark, 1496 to 1529. The spark of moral enthusiasm was kindled at Florence by Savanarola, which was caught up in England by John Colet, born in 1466, the same year probably as the cosmopolitan associate Erasmus, and 12 years before Thomas More, the son of a wealthy and successful London merchant who held the office of mayor. Colet went to Oxford, where, being still a young man, was inspired with a thirst for the new learning by Grocyn and Linacre, who were beginning to introduce the new learning from Italy. A thirst associated in his case with a religious turn of thought, which made him deliberately elect to take orders in preference to pursuing the brilliant prospects undoubtedly opened by a secular career to a man of his capacity, backed up by his father's wealth and established position. About 1494, he visited Italy, the home of scholars, leaving behind him at Oxford young More, who, according to the not unusual practice, had gone up to the university at age 14, and whose brilliant gifts and fascinating character had probably enabled him to form an intimacy which was to be lifelong with his senior. Whether in the course of his travels Colet fell under the direct personal influence of Savanarola is uncertain, but it is hardly likely that he would have omitted some sojourn at Florence when the great preacher was at the height of his fame. At any rate, he returned to Oxford in 1496, his mind greatly enriched by his experiences, and forthwith commenced to deliver a series of lectures on the Pauline epistles, which contributed a new departure in university teaching. The fundamental change was the application of a new method, the method of critical exposition, taking the place of scholastic dissection, studying of a course, discourse, or treatise, instead of dealing with a collection of texts and paraphrases. The old way of commenting, as it were, miscellaneous congeries of sentences, each of which had to be elucidated, interpreted, complicated, reinterpreted, interpreted, illustrated by other sentences, relevant or irrelevant, allegorized, referred to authority, referred to each other, and so prepared for interpretation all over again in an infant series, gave place to an intelligent search for the meaning of the writer. Out of this again, the perception that the Pauline epistles were exceedingly practical treatises on life and conduct, rather than a collection of puzzles for the exercise of erudite ingenuity, and the lecturer's enthusiasm for the vividly human personality of the great apostle communicated itself to his hearers, sowing the seeds of revolt not against the church, but against scholasticism. The movement was thus initiated was not in its nature at all inimical to orthodoxy. There was no suggestion of heresy about it. It involved simply an appeal to the learned study of sacred texts in the tongues in which they were written, treating them as extracts from Duns and Aquinas. It was a challenge to the doctors of the church, not an attack on the dogmas of the church. The teacher was eloquent, vigorous, learned, original, and very much in earnest. His lectures gathered around him intelligence of the university and made no little stir. God did not confine his attentions exclusively to St. Paul, but was ready to apply the critical principles to the whole of Scriptures, Old and New Testament alike, dwelling constantly on the importance of going to the fountainhead and reading the originals. Instead of treating the Vulgate as a verbally inspired version, as was the common habit, even ordinarily cultivated persons were still very much disposed to regard Greek as a dangerous heathen tongue, the study of which might lead the student woefully astray. And Thomas More seems to have hurried away from the university by his father in order to take work seriously as a law student, because the language of Plato was suspected of being too alluring. The scholastic prejudices were too long established and too deeply rooted to be immediately removed. The local vis inertiae offered stolid resistance, but the movement appealed strongly to everything that was best at Oxford. The peculiar characteristic of the new learning in England was that, practically from the beginning, it was turned into a channel of biblical research and religious inquiry by men who were Christians first and scholars afterwards, instead of, as happened in Italy, the pursuit of pagan ideals by men who were scholars first and Christians afterwards, if indeed they were Christians at all in anything but outward profession. A few years later, 1504-1505, Colet was made Dean of St. Paul's and transferred his activities to London, where he rapidly achieved the highest reputation as a preacher, whose conversation and private life maintained the same high level as his pulpit utterances, and his personal character was convincingly admirable. It was while he was still at Oxford that Colet and Erasmus became acquainted. Possibly they had met before in Paris. In 1498, Erasmus, visiting England, was attracted to the university on the Issus, formed a deep and lasting friendship with Colet and with More. More was to play his part in the movement as a politician, statesman, man of letters, moving in the world of affairs. Colet played his as a preacher and teacher in Oxford and London. Not only scholars, but kings, princes, and prelates in every European state were to listen to the voice of Erasmus, though yet he had not achieved his later position. At this time, in fact, Erasmus was Colet's pupil. His Latinity was superior, but in Greek he was still a long way behind, and Greek was very much more important than Latin. The direction and inspiration which Erasmus derived from Colet were to issue later is a work of vast importance and of more immediate consequences not only to England but to all Europe than anything written by Colet himself. Yet for Colet it is likely enough that it would never have been written at all. 18 years, however, were to elapse before Erasmus published his edition of the Greek New Testament. When he left Oxford after a brief sojourn, it was much against the will of Colet, who would have persuaded him then to devote himself to exegesis. But Erasmus was wiser, knowing that he had yet very much to learn before he could speak, that with that confidence in himself which was needful to convince others. In the interval, Colet was transferred to the deanery. More, still a beardless boy, so distinguished himself in Parliament by his successful opposition to one of Henry VII's demands for subsidies that he had to retire for a while into private life. And when Erasmus returned to England for another brief visit in 1505, he found his two friends established in London and in constant, intimate intercourse. In 1509, Henry VII died, and Henry, at the age of 18, succeeded him, being at that time a youth of the most brilliant promise. To a magnificent physique were joined in him a brain of unusual acuteness, a geniality of manner, and a wealth of intellectual culture, which gave hopes of a right royal disposition, hopes to be marred by the gradual development of cold-blooded selfishness and a fiery temper which as had yet not betrayed themselves. The dead king had been an exceptionally astute, strong, and capable monarch, but his sordid avarice, whatever political advantages it may have conferred, had made him intensely unpopular. The accession of the young prince, endowed with every attractive quality, was hailed on all hands with an outburst of enthusiasm. The Saturnian rule was to be renewed. Golden age was to return. The instruments of his father's tyranny were cast down. Learning, arts, civil justice were to flourish in the land. The friends of Erasmus urged him to make haste to return and rejoice in the sunlight. Erasmus came, and the sun continued to shine. The high spirits of himself and his friends were reflected in Encomium Mori, or Praise of Folly, which he wrote and published soon after his arrival, a light-hearted satire on the follies, chiefly of scholastical and ecclesiastical, of the day, which in humorous vein strikes the keynote of reform, as it was understood by scholars and men of wit, necessarily avoiding in expression the high seriousness which lay behind. The gift of combining that high seriousness with a subtle and ever-present humor, the jest which covers an earnest meaning, the earnest which is conveyed in jesting form, was Thomas More's, which shortly afterwards in 1516 took the form of Utopia. With greater clearness, because more seriously than the Praise of Folly, Utopia conveys the attitude of the reformers before Luther had identified with the war against papacy. In depicting his imaginary state in an otherwise unknown quarter of the New World, which Columbus had just revealed to Europe, More was obviously not designing a society such as might, in his view, have been reconstructed out of a European country, any more than Plato would have supposed it possible to reconstruct Athens on the system of his republic. But some fairly conclusive inferences can be drawn as to the prevailing social conditions and the kind of improvements which seemed desirable. More himself would hardly have proposed to introduce his idealist conditions by legislation. He starts from a position which has no political theorist will question, which nevertheless was in singular contrast to the practice of the time. This is the Platonic doctrine, that it is the function of the governor to rule for the benefit of the governed. If Thrasymachus could only have studied the Prince of Machiavelli, he would have felt even more thoroughly convinced that there was something hopelessly wrong with the Socratic argument, that it was in fact irredeemably opposed to human nature. But the Utopia no less obviously assumes that the doctrine is a complete invasion of all recognized practice. Its action author was evidently quite of the opinion that so long as the princes were in the habit of hankering for extended dominions, so long as their actual dominions were doomed to rule. From the portions of his book which dealt with sumptuary and economic conditions, it is easy to infer an England in which a vast army of drones polled and shaved the workers, wealthy men with swarms of his retainers, vagabonds who would not dig and were not at all ashamed to beg. And in this host of the unproductive, he expressly includes the so great and so idle company of priests and religious men, as they call them. The last item is made peculiarly significant by this extreme restriction of the number of priests in Utopia, 13 of them in every city, who are of exceeding holiness, being so few. Quite evidently, there is in More's mind no disparagement of the priestly office, but on the contrary, a very strong conviction that the multiplication of the religious is in every way demoralizing. At the same time, there is none of that extravagant condemnation in which the later enthusiasts for Reformation were wont to indulge. The whole section of the Utopia which touches on religion strikes the note which one would expect: toleration for all opinions, provided that they are expressed with decency and not actually immoral in tendency. More held with Erasmus and Colet that the intricacies of doctrine were not essential, provided that the cardinal facts are realized. For the Utopians condemn those who deny the deity and future life. At the same time, the traveler, Raphael Hythodly, is obviously of the opinion that they were fully justified in suppressing the zealous Christian, whose word in season was too sulphurous for the public peace. That is the real explanation of the apparent contradiction between the reformer More's theory of tolerance and the Lord Chancellor's practice of persecution. The peasants' war had come in the interval, and the heretics on whom he laid stern hands were those whose language was violence and their theories anarchical, at least prima facie. A high standard of personal morality, a large toleration for divergences on essential points, a rejection of grossly materialistic excretions and palpable abuses, a contempt for the uncritical and supersubtle logomachy of the schools, a desire to welcome light and spread knowledge, all this being conducted with a due regard to public order and discipline. These were the common characteristics of the scholar reformers. On the critical side, these views found their weightiest expression in the edition of the New Testament which Erasmus published in 1516. The work of his application of the principle which he had learned 18 years before from Colet, of going to the Greek to find what the evangelists and apostles wrote. Erasmus issued a Greek text with introductions and with his own Latin translation beside it. Textual criticism was in its fancy, and he was never by any means a master of Greek philosophy. The text and translation were before a long way from perfection, but the publication broke up the stereotype tradition which had regarded the Vulgate as verbally inspired, and a great step was taken in developing among the younger generation the practice of studying the scriptures themselves in preference to the commentaries of the doctors. That practice had been initiated at Oxford by Colet, and was carried to Cambridge by Erasmus himself, who became the professor of Greek in 1511 under the patronage of Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. There can be little doubt that Cranmer, then at Cambridge, and about 20 years of age, fell under the influences of the great scholar. Though there is no record of any personal intercourse between them. How matters stood on the more definitely religious side of the movement may be seen from Colet's career at this time. Sporadic examples of Lollardism, and on the part of the men of the old school, such as Fitzjames, Bishop of London, some alarm at the newfangled methods of Colet himself and his associates and disciples, combined to interest the king and Convocation in the extirpation of heresy, to which particular end the assembly was summoned at the beginning of 1512. The proceedings, however, show clearly enough that the alarm did not extend to ecclesiastics of any intellectual eminence. Colet himself was appointed to preach the opening sermon. Prosecutions for heresies diminished instead of increasing, and an attempt on the part of Fitzjames to have the dean punished as a heretic was ignominiously snuffed out by an archbishop who was eminently on good terms with Erasmus. The sermon amounted to a program of Reformation declared by Colet, a process of curing heresy by common sense and right living, instead of the favorite prescription of cautery. Primarily, it was an indictment of the secular and worldly way of life prevalent among the clergy, the pursuit of promotion of highly paid benefices, of pluralities, the legal greed of the ecclesiastical courts, the devotion to secular occupations, things for which a remedy could be found if the clergy, from the bishops down, would merely exert themselves in their own persons to adopt something like the standard which they were in any case bound to profess. The moral was quite clear. If the clergy set an example of spiritual living, very little more would be heard of heresy, whereof the exciting cause was usually to be found in a comparison between the way of life of the apostles and that of their successors, greatly to the disparagement of the latter. The dean was plain-spoken and straightforward, and did not shirk applying home truths to the greatest, from Wolsey down. Therefore, what he did not say may be put to the credit of his fellow churchmen, so that it was to be noted that the temptations to which he charges them with yielding are not those of the flesh and the devil, but of the world. If the immorality is so freely attributed, more particularly to the regular clergy by the advanced reformers, had been half so flagrant as was commonly alleged, it's hardly conceivable that Colet would have abstained from strong expressions on the subject. Here, then, is the note of the Reformation, which was actually in steady progress before Luther lifted the voice, Pope Leo, by taking up the challenge and resisting the movement, converted its development into a partisan struggle of creeds. For the knell of the old stubborn and willful ignorance was already being tolled. There was indeed little sign that the ecclesiastical magnates intended to withdraw from the state affairs. When Wolsey was the king's chief counselor, and for many a year to come, the Tunstals and Gardners were to be active politicians. But already among the men who were Colet's contemporaries and seniors, all the most distinguished men were men of character and advocates of educational progress, such as Warham and Fisher, and the younger men, Gardner and Latimer and Tunstall. The universities were following the new lights rather than the old tradition. Wolsey, founding Cardinal College at Oxford with the proceeds of suppressed monastic establishments of ill repute, filled it with pupils of the advanced teachers. Colet in his own school in St. Paul's in London set the example of converting pedagogy into education, which system he thoroughly established before his death in 1519. But the outlook of the Reformation to be affected by sweetness and light was shattered by two revolts, utterly different in character, motive, and intention, that of Luther in Germany and that of King Henry in England, whereby the Reformation became a revolution. Let us pray. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.